Hey, as the next improvement to our cryptocurrency frontend, let's build a detailed view for the transactions. Currently, we're stringifying all the transaction data and then cutting it off after 35 characters. Now, this is nice to keep the blocks small within the list and not blow up the entire application. But it'd be ideal for all the transaction information to somehow be available. So why not introduce a mechanism which will allow the user to toggle a view between this minified transaction output and a way more informative transaction display. To begin, we're going to introduce a state field to the actual block class. And this state field allows us to keep track of a display transaction flag, which by default is going to be false. But the idea is, if display transaction becomes true, we're going to blow up the data display to something way more informative than this 35 character cutoff. If display transaction remains false though, we'll continue to show the shortened display. Alright, to support this, we're going to have a method within here, which is also going to be a class property, so a variable set equal to a callback function. And this toggle transaction callback function is going to switch the state of display transaction to whatever its opposite value current is. So currently this .state.display transaction will either be false or true, but by using the bang operator and then setting the state on that, we can flip the flag every time. All right. Now this allows us to add custom logic in the render method to either display the shortened transaction or the full-on transaction, depending on the Boolean value of this .state.display transaction. And then to do custom logic within React, the convention that I prefer to use is a get computed property. So we have the getter syntax, so add a get keyword, and then display transaction is a computed property name. The main advantage of a computed property is that this isn't a function. It takes on the type of whatever it ends up returning. So for example, if we return JSX from the computed property, display transaction itself is returning and is the type of that JSX. For example, we can have text in here that says display transaction, and we can even have custom logic like a string within here. So example string, we'll say this is example, and we can include that example string within the computed property itself. And now in our render method, rather than having to blow this up with a bunch of custom logic, we can opt to use this .display transaction. And then it's as if we wrote the JSX from display transaction directly within the render method itself, because of the fact display transaction has the same type as its own return value. To explore this further, let's add a console.log of this .display transaction at the top of the render method. We're also going to log the object itself, so the string identifies what we're actually logging. All right, give that a save, and then in the command line, the updates should have been picked up. Now in the browser, we need to refresh to redo the requests. And yep, we see display transaction example, so neat. Our JSX for the display transaction computed property is definitely working. But the thing to look at is the command line and the console, because in the console we see that this .display transaction is an object. And on further investigation, it's not only an object, it's a symbol of a React element. So it's actual JSX that we can use. Now this is radically different from a method where we can have a display transaction method that returns JSX just like so. It's going to be a little different though. You'll find that in the command line after this change, that the information within the display is actually missing. So it doesn't immediately return the JSX because it's a function. It's not a symbol of React element itself. In order to use this, we're going to have to call this .display transaction directly within our render method. And on a save of that, we find display transaction example once again returning. But the disadvantage to this is that every time we call the render method, this .display transaction is then recalled, and then whatever logic we have within here is then re-evaluated by the JavaScript. Whereas with the get computed property syntax, the JSX remains the same every single time. Okay, cool. So with that down, we now see an advantage to using the getComputed property. And overall, it does look much cleaner when we can refer to this.display transaction itself. Now, the idea with this computed property is that we're going to move all the logic related to the data to display transaction. So let's grab stringify data and data display and place it within display transaction. We need the line to destructure the data from this.props.block. So let's get the data field. We no longer need the data field within the render method. And by default, it's now going to return this data label with the data display as the final line of the computed property itself. All right, cool. So make sure you have that change. No longer need this example string. Go ahead and save that. So overall, have the display transaction computed property as well as the reference to it itself. And now in the actual application, what we find is that our data display is still working in terms of showing the data label as well as the transaction cutoff information. Cool. Now our overall strategy with this is going to be to add a button to display transaction. And by clicking this button, we're going to call toggle transaction. And based on that state value, we're either going to continue to show the shortened form. So display transaction, if it's false, will show the shortened form. But if it's true, we're going to show a much more full-on data display. Now, there is a native element button available, but in this case, we're going to use a button component from React Bootstrap, since it comes with immediate styling benefits. So on the command line, open up a new tab and make sure to install React Bootstrap, which as of this course is at version 0.32.4. Make sure to have the save flag to install this as a dependency as well. All right, and with React Bootstrap installed, we can now go back to the block component. And at the top of the file, we're going to import the button class, which is not the default export, so use a pair of curly braces, from React Bootstrap. All right, cool. And now let's add a button to our data display. So rather than a div that only shows this data label and the data display, we're also going to have some button JSX within here. So a pair of button component tags that says show more. All right, nice. Let's also place the data in its own div. And for multi-line returns of JSX, it's conventional to include this within a pair of parentheses for cleaner syntax. So overall, let's grab this entire piece of JSX, and then we're going to place this within a pair of parentheses to keep it looking clean. Cool. Now, this button has a couple properties which we can use to immediately style it. First, there is the danger style. So BS style, notice that the second S is capitalized. We're going to set it to danger, which gives it a nice red color. Be a size small, so that way it doesn't look that big on the actual appearance of the application. But now the most important part to this is an on-click handler. And when clicked, this button should toggle the transaction display. So we'll have a this.toggle transaction reference right within onClick. Now this line is rather long, so what we can do is we can place all of these properties on their own line for the button. All right, and this should go on its own line over here, and the closing button tag should match. Cool. Now by clicking this button, this will set display transaction to true within the state, which means that, well, we should display something else if the Boolean has been flipped. So let's add an if condition, which will recognize that when this.state.display transaction is true, so this will implicitly check equal to true, then we're going to return some other piece of JSX. And this is going to be a more full-on version of the overall display. For now, to keep things quick, let's show the full-on stringified version of the data. Later on, we're going to have a more full-on representation of the transaction component. Let's add a break element in here. And then the same thing, we're going to have a button which we'll call toggle transaction. But in this case, instead of saying show more, well, now we're in the case where we want to show less. Because after all, this has been toggled, we're showing the full-on transaction. So if we want to minimize, again, the button should say show less. Let's keep the danger and small BS stylings. And then we have this.toggle transaction to switch this.display transaction once more. Cool. So the overall logic with this is If we recognize that this .display transaction is true, we're going to return a full-on JSX display of the transaction earlier. Otherwise, we're going to return the normal data display. So once you have all of those changes, go ahead and save the file. And then in the browser, let's give the application a refresh. And what we find is the Show More button. Very cool. Let's click on Show More of the first one. And what we find is that, well, the full-on display is quite huge. So there's all the transaction data. Now, the experience is quite jarring. It's overflowing the window, but at least we're seeing all the information. But this still isn't ideal. So in the next one, let's make a transaction component, which is going to display each transaction through a much cleaner presentation than simply stringifying the entire transaction data field. All right, let's do that next.